Great. Thanks, Abbas. Thanks for the kind introduction. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with everybody today.
Khushamadid, Sina.
Yeah, merci. I'm actually, I was born, for those of you that don't know, I was born in Iran, and my family immigrated to Canada in 1994. So for those of you that are new to the country, having been 10 years old essentially when I came to Canada, I've actually gone through the whole integration process, and I can't thank Dr. Nakvi enough for putting this together. It's a resource, and really good speakers today and yesterday, helping you get more familiar with what's going on in Canadian dentistry. So without further ado, the topic of my presentation today is how group practices and dental support organizations are reshaping Canadian dentistry. And the agenda for today's presentation, I'm gonna just very briefly, since Abbas already went over my background, give you an idea of what I've done. I'm going to talk about what dental support organizations are and discuss some of the key trends that we're seeing within the Canadian market specifically. We're going to also discuss what is fueling the growth of dental support organizations in Canada. We're also going to discuss what emerging and alternative business models exist within the DSO landscape. And I will leave plenty of time near the end of this particular presentation for questions and answers. So feel free to either utilize the chat window to submit your questions, or alternatively, towards the end, you can unmute your microphone and I'll be taking those questions from the audience. So why should you listen to this presentation? As Abbas mentioned, I've been in the healthcare industry for approximately 14 years. I've worked with vendors, I've worked with healthcare providers, I've been on the provider side, and also most recently with dental insurance companies. So the payer side of the industry is also something that I fully understand. 5 of those 14 years was spent specifically in healthcare real estate, helping dentists with site selection, practice relocations, and commercial tenant representation. I was most recently the vice president of clinical operations at a national private equity-backed dental support organization, and have advised emerging as well as new DSOs across Canada and the US. So what are DSOs? You'll hear this term if you are new to Canada, you'll start to hear it more often. And DSOs, the acronym essentially stands for Dental Support Organization or Dental Service Organization. You'll sometimes also hear people referring to DSOs as corporate dentistry. So if you hear that term, sometimes it's used as a replacement for the term DSO. What dental support organizations are is they essentially contract with practices to provide business management and support services. So they are separate legal entities that deliver business services to clinicians. They do not replace clinicians in the sense that you cannot operate a dental clinic and treat patients without having dentists on staff. So DSOs do affiliate directly with these clinicians, and the clinicians are the ones delivering the care, and the DSO is the one doing all of the back office functions, including such functions as accounting, legal, finance, IT, HR. Compliance is even a bigger issue within the last 3 years, and they do deliver compliance-related services as well. And the point of the DSOs essentially take the burden off of the clinician, so that the clinician, rather than spending up to 40% of their time on doing paperwork, they can actually do what they enjoy. With regards to the comment about paperwork, I will say that prior to working directly at a DSO, when I was consulting solo practices, one of the common complaints that I'd hear from solo practice owners was the fact that they often felt they were burdened with the paperwork, the administrative side of their clinic. And for many of those clinicians, they don't enjoy the HR aspects of running a practice. And so some of these DSOs are a good fit for those clinicians that decide, I really don't want anything to do with the business of dentistry. I would much rather just treat my own patients and have the flexibility to be able to leave at the end of the day, not worrying at night about whether or not my office is going to be inspected, whether or not I'm going to have to hire that office manager. And DSOs are offering those services so that the clinician can essentially sleep better at night. Now, I will say that, depending on the type of dentist you are, not all DSOs will be a good fit for you. So what I mean by that is there are different types of DSOs in the marketplace, and some of those DSOs offer different services, and some of those DSOs have different partnership arrangements with dentists, meaning you may actually own some of the non-clinical assets of your clinic, and you may even profit in the event that the particular practice decides to be sold. So we'll also discuss how DSOs deploy different strategies. I will say that some DSOs in Canada will only build practices from scratch. The majority, however, decide to partner with practices that already exist. And they generally look for practices that have, ideally minimum of 4 operatories and are ideally doing north of $800,000 in gross production. And the reason for that is because it's a lot easier to manage multiple practices in a particular province if these practices are larger practices rather than 2 or 3 operatory clinics. Sometimes it takes the same amount of resources supporting 10 small offices than it would, for example, supporting 15 larger ones. So we'll talk a little bit about the nuances with regards to DSOs as well. Now, there are also dental support organizations that blend both what I call startups or de novo practices with the concept of acquiring offices. And yesterday you heard from one particular founder who discussed the fact that his last office was actually a startup, but historically he'd done mostly business acquisitions. And one of the common, I would say, misconceptions with regards to DSOs is the fact that some people believe the DSO is intentionally not willing to or looking to disclose the locations that they support. And I can tell you firsthand, having worked at one, that generally speaking, the reason why a DSO does not rebrand a particular clinic after affiliation is because of cost. In fact, when I was tasked with deciding whether or not to rebrand the clinics that I oversaw that were primarily acquisitions, when we scoped out the cost of changing the storefront signage, as well as the rebranding and replacing the stationery, those costs per location could easily exceed $30,000. And a lot of DSOs defer not to go through the process of rebranding the particular clinic, especially if the clinic has been long established in the community, has a particular brand and goodwill in the community. When you rebrand a particular clinic, the risk that you run is that you could end up essentially confusing the local community with regards to whether or not that particular office, the provider is no longer there. And most dental support organizations that go through acquisitions, they in fact prefer to keep the selling dentist on board. Some of them may decide if the selling dentist wants to leave after a year, that's okay. But I would say that the majority of dental support organizations prefer for the selling dentist to stay on minimum, I would say, of 2 years up to 5 years. And the reason for that is very simple. They understand that a dental practice has a lot of goodwill. And once you lose the staff or the clinician, that goodwill can quickly evaporate. Now, some of the industry dynamics that we've come across are things such as the fact that there are a lot of, I would say, vendors in the marketplace that may feel a bit threatened by the fact that DSOs exist and are continuing to grow. And the reason for that is quite simple. Dental support organizations generally have greater bargaining or negotiation power than independent practices. And as they continue to grow, they have less of a requirement to outsource certain business functions, right? For example, they may decide that they're going to not hire external recruiters or not hire external, let's say, lawyers, because they have the ability to put those professionals on their payroll full time because of the number of clinics that they support. So the industry dynamics are that a lot of traditional service providers have had to change or adapt their business model in order to be able to thrive within this industry. And I think they can, because DSOs are not the majority of the marketplace today, and plenty of solo practices would like to have the benefit of having the business advice that DSOs could bring without necessarily affiliating with one. The largest dental support organization in Canada had a value of $1.7 billion in 2018. And I will say that there are DSOs operating across the world that are even larger. I've done work in the United States market, and I can tell you that the largest dental support organization in the US today has more than 1,000 dental practices across the country. So now I'm going to discuss the rise of group practices and DSOs in Canada, now that we've talked about what DSOs are. And you'll notice from this particular slide that I've identified approximately 239 entities that have 3 or more locations in Canada. So keep in mind that here we're discussing not just DSOs, we're also including group practices in our analysis of the marketplace. And the average group practice, or DSO, has an internal annual growth rate of 13%. There are plenty of dental support organizations and group practices that have an annual growth rate that exceeds that. In fact, the one that I was part of was able to double its revenue within a year, as well as its profitability by acquisitions. And so a lot of dental support organizations will grow faster than 50%, in some cases more than 100%, depending on whether or not they're acquiring. Now, the estimated market share of group practices, as well as dental support organizations in Canada, are approximately 14%. So if you look across the country from 2012 to 2019, what you'll notice is back in 2012, there were only roughly 31 group practices and dental support organizations. I don't mean 31 practices, these are 31 entities that own more than 3 locations. And from 2012 all the way to 2019, what we saw on average was a 41% annual growth rate with regards to group practices and dental support organizations. 1 in 7 practices in Canada today are part of a group. And that's a growing number, and it's growing every particular year. And it's important for us to recognize that more and more practices are opting to be part of a group. And it may not necessarily be a dental support organization. There are entrepreneurial dentists out there that only own 3 or 4 locations that would be more than willing to take on the business services and offer those services to a practice so that the clinician can essentially just do the dentistry. Now, 64% of the group dentistry market is comprised of entities that have 3 to 5 practices. So the majority of the group practice market today is comprised of entities that only have 3 to 5 offices. 23% of the group dentistry market is comprised of entities that have 6 to 10 practices, and only roughly 5% of DSOs or groups have 20 or more locations. So 95% of the market happens to be less than 20 offices, and the majority of those within a group space are 3 to 5 practices. So what are the trends that are fueling the growth of DSOs, and how did dental support organizations actually end up growing so large over this time span. One of the trends that you'll notice is that in Canada, we have had declining interest rates. So credit is extremely cheap, and that has benefited both dentists as well as investors. And with declining interest rates, more and more dentists are looking to own more than one office because the cost of borrowing money has been reduced. In fact, if you look at 2008, when we had the financial crisis that started in the US because of the subprime mortgages, the central banks, starting with the US, decided to lower the interest rates in order to stimulate the economy. And what happened from 2008 all the way to now 2020 is we've seen a growing trend with regards to the number of dentists that want to own more than one office and are going to the bank and are able to actually borrow money to finance usually up to 3 locations using purely debt. The other reason why DSOs and group practices have grown within Canada is because of demographics. The largest segment of business owners in Canada are baby boomers. This is not just in the dental space. In fact, if you look around your community and you take a look at the generation that the average small business owner falls into, there are a lot of baby boomers that are going through the process of retiring. And a lot of those baby boomers, they've benefited from Canada's healthcare system, meaning that they thankfully are healthy enough to continue to work. But what they would like is they would like to have the benefit of liquidity, meaning they'd like to be able to de-risk their asset by essentially handing it over to somebody else in exchange for cash, but would like to continue to work at that location until later in life. And that's not necessarily, retirement at 65. So dental support organizations have been able to be have been relevant to a lot of these baby boomers because those dentists may say, I'd like to be able to sell my practice without necessarily retiring tomorrow. The other thing that we're seeing is rising tuition costs. So the post-secondary tuition costs have increased faster than the inflation rate for dental, medical, and other programs across the country. And because of the rising student debt, what a lot of students are doing is deferring practice ownership and opting to instead associate somewhere. And some of those associates are attracted to working for a dental support organization affiliated office because unlike an office where there may be a principal dentist there all the time, their schedule doesn't maybe fluctuate as much as it would if there was another dentist that was relying on that practice to make an income. So there are practices, 4 operatories, 5 operatories, where you can have one associate dentist in that office, and they could essentially practice in that location for as long as they wanted to because of the fact that there is no second dentist practicing there. That particular dentist, if they are practicing there, may work 1 or 2 days a week. And so some students are attracted to that option. The other factor is the fact that startup costs have increased over the last 10 years. So the average cost of starting a practice today is approximately $600,000. Now it is an average cost, right? You could go to a remote community and start a practice for less than that. But what we're seeing is the cost of building practices in urban areas has increased because of the cost of labor. I've utilized general contractors in doing office renovations and helping doctors with startups. And for any of you that have worked with general contractors, you know that they're not cheap and there's a lot of work that goes into building out a dental office. The other thing that we're seeing is asset inflation. So one of the comments that has been made throughout different conferences is this idea that practice purchases, price of a general practice is going up, and the value of the practice must also be going up. I actually believe that what's really happening is the Canadian dollar and really most fiat currencies are being devalued. And when those currencies are devalued because credit is so cheap and the central banks are printing money, it increases the value of existing assets, houses, the stock market, as well as dental practices. And because the value of these assets have increased, it's becoming more out of reach for a 30-something-year-old dentist to be able to get into the game. And as a result of that, because of the roughly doubling of the valuation of the average dental practice over the last 5 years, again, a lot of associates are deferring ownership and opting to be working for a group or maybe working for somebody else. The other thing that I'm noticing is, younger dentists are looking for greater work-life balance. And I've talked to younger foreign-trained dentists, and it's interesting to me that some of them have the same values as a Canadian graduate would, in the sense that they like the idea of being able to leave the office at 5 or 6 o'clock and not be burdened with the debt or the management headaches of running a clinic. And those dentists tend to want to partner with somebody or want to join again a DS affiliated practice for the work-life balance that they're seeking. In fact, the affiliation rate by female dentists with DSOs tends to be a bit higher, primarily because of the role that female dentists play in the household and the contributions they make to raising kids, etc. We're also seeing greater intensity of competition. Now, don't get me wrong, Canada is a wonderful country to be a dentist. In fact, if you look around the world, the dentist population ratio has actually declined further than Canada. So in Canada, we actually have a better population to dentist ratio than a lot of other countries, in fact, most other countries. But nevertheless, in Canada, the population dentist ratio has declined over the past 15 years, particularly for urban areas. And this has meant greater competition between dentists. But again, it is a good profession to earn a living, and nowhere has the population to dentist ratio been eroded to the extent in Canada that it has been in other places. We're also seeing wage inflation. So for those of you that have worked in a dental office in Canada, you'll notice the owners talking about shortage of dental assistants leading to salary increases. And a lot of dentists are opting to either hire a recruiter externally or join a dental support organization because they don't want to deal with the headache of having to find this talent. And some DSOs have actually done a lot of work in figuring out how to train individuals that are not dental assistants, providing them with subsidies, and then helping them get into the profession so that there's more dental assistants available to support the dentists. Now, there are different types of emerging models in Canada and the US, and I'm going to spend a few minutes discussing what those models are for your benefit. So the typical DSO may, as I mentioned, partner with clinicians on either starting a practice or acquiring an office. But there are different alternative models you may come across. So as an example, there are buying groups out there. In fact, I believe Sean Piers presented yesterday will be the first to tell you that he has a buying group, and he basically utilizes the collective bargaining power of solo practices and clinicians to obtain volume-based discounts for his members. And a buying group has the advantage of giving you the ability to benefit from, again, discounts on sundries and even equipment without having to give the keys of your office to somebody else, or having to basically outsource any of your business functions to a dental support organization. There are also franchises, and franchises have existed for many, many years in other industries. As you may recall, if you walk around your community, you'll come across a lot of franchises in the restaurant industry, as an example. So franchises within dentistry, they trademark territories, and they provide clinicians with exclusivity over that territory. and they standardize certain functions, but they don't exert any sort of control over the actual running of the clinic. You're really utilizing the brand somebody else has developed in order to attract patients. Now, franchises in Canada today are not really popular, but they have kind of rebounded, meaning the franchise model existed in the US many years ago. There was a franchise in BC that became somewhat popular, but over the years, they declined in popularity, and now they're kind of starting to come back. And so it'd be interesting to see what sort of models result from that. Now, there are also what I call strategic affiliate programs, and these strategic affiliate programs deliver a limited set of non-clinical support services to practice owners, generally for a fee of about 3 to 6% of gross revenues. So you may have a practice today and you may decide, I'm going to sign this affiliation agreement, and in exchange for giving 3 to 6% of my gross production, I'm going to benefit from professional services, including HR, accounting, legal, etc. Here, you're actually not selling your equipment, you're not selling your goodwill, you're simply exchanging money for these services. And the thought behind this is that it would be cheaper to do so because you're dealing usually with one company rather than having to hire multiple companies to offer the same services. And what you have to really look at for when it comes to affiliate programs is just making sure that the company offering those services provides a consistent service across those different business functions, because it's very difficult to have the best lawyer, as well as the best practice management consultant, as well as the best accountant, all under one roof. There are also what I call non-captive dental support organizations. So similar to an affiliate program, but the practice can actually cancel these services at any time with the advance written notice. It could be 30 to 60 days. So a strategic affiliate program may lock you in for more than a year. The non-captive dental support organization provides the same services without actually having you be locked into a long-term contract. And this is a very flexible option for those that want to try out certain services without actually committing. And the non-captive DSO doesn't really exist in Canada. However, it is a model that has emerged in the US and will probably come to Canada at some point. There's also what we call loosely affiliated dental organizations. So these are formed when separate practices come together in order to negotiate volume-based discounts with suppliers, as well as to maximize their sale price during a collective transition. And there is still what I call a loosely affiliated dental organization that has actually come to Canada. And this particular organization does have the goal of ensuring that the clinician doesn't have to sell their practice to anybody during the term of their agreement, but when they're ready to sell, they can basically come together with other clinicians also looking to sell their practice, and collectively they can negotiate a better price for their business. And the point of this is to go to a private equity firm or to go to a large dental support organization and maximize the value of those members by selling 10 or 20 practices at the same time. So that concept theoretically should work. Whether or not it works from an applied model standpoint is to be seen in Canada, because the LADDO model has been relatively new in this marketplace. Last but not least, there are direct-to-consumer DSOs. And what's interesting is that the internet has essentially enabled these companies to bypass traditional doctor-patient referral channels for specialty services such as orthodontics by marketing directly to the consumer. And some of these direct-to-consumer DSOs actually have retail operations. They have brick and mortar retail operations. Others do not. But I can tell you that over the last few years, they have attracted a lot of regulatory scrutiny, and a lot of these direct-to-consumer dental support organizations have decided to change their business model to utilize the dentist more, given all of the regulatory headaches that they've had when it comes to expanding in certain provinces and states. but those direct-to-consumer DSOs are becoming more popular, particularly for patients that could not otherwise afford treatment, because they may associate, for example, a higher cost for going to an orthodontist. And when they see an ad on social media with regards to clear braces, and they can have those clear braces for maybe $80 a month on a payment plan, they become attracted to that. And I can't comment, I'm not a dentist, I can't comment on the efficacy of these particular services, but it is a trend to be mindful of. And I do consider them in many ways dental support organizations, because they do work with clinicians and they're essentially marketing to get those patients in. And the whole point of this is to do so on a national scale to reduce the cost of acquisition. So with that, I'll take any questions that you guys have with regards to dental support organizations. And if you'd like to contact me, my contact information is on the screen, so feel free to do so.
Thank you, Sina. Are there any direct-to-consumer DSOs in Canada, especially BC? Is a question.
So that's a great question. So you'll hear of the company Smile Direct Club. So I would say that Smile Direct Club is one of the bigger direct-to-consumer companies.